As far as current political discourse is concerned, one accusation that's been levied against the right repeatedly is this notion that they don't know what they're talking about when it comes to terms like postmodernism and Marxism. And to some extent, those making this critique are right. There are many figures with considerable influence on the right who haphazardly use these words interchangeably and conflate them to mean the same thing. To be fair, though, this is hardly something that the right is exclusively guilty of. After all, it's a fairly pervasive practice on the left to invoke terms like Nazi or fascist when encountering an idea that leans right, regardless if the person in question actually harbors beliefs relating to racial superiority, expansionistic ultranationalism, or a peachy view of the Fuhrer himself. So yeah, disparaging phrases and the misuse of political terminology to create caricatures to discredit the other side, even when it is not befitting or makes sense, is endemic on both camps, and frankly, in my opinion, is just a reflection of human nature. When confronting a person who disagrees with you, it is always easier to assume that they are either dumb or malicious and put them in a box, rather than view them as someone who is simply of a different opinion after a further examination of evidence and an accumulation of self-experiences that differ from your own, which may lead one to a different outcome. So is that it? Do some of the detractors of ideas like Marxism or postmodernism, do they just simply not understand them in their entirety and opt to just reduce them to buzzwords to invoke fear and suspicion amongst their ranks? And as a caveat, I consider myself someone decently well-read when it comes to these concepts. However, I'm by no means an expert. I don't have a PhD in philosophy. I don't ruminate on the nuances and idiosyncrasies of 20th century French thought or whatever. So yeah, I'm not an expert. I would always recommend people to look into this stuff themselves and compare and contrast different viewpoints on any given subject. I welcome additional insight and constructive criticism when it comes to the stuff that I spew out of my mouth. It's by no means infallible, and I suppose unconstructive criticism is fine too. So yeah, Marxism and postmodernism are indeed different concepts, and if they're different, and smart people should know that they're different, why is it that a lot of people who appear to be smart people use such compound constructions like postmodern neo-Marxist? Let's break it down. What is postmodernism exactly? Postmodernism is the idea that society is bounded together by socially constructed paradigms and definitions. As Michel Foucault, one of the grandfathers of this school of thought, affirms, what is found at the historical beginning of things is not the inviolable identity of their origins. It is the dissension of other things. It is disparity. This extends to how language operates, what roles are acceptable for you to play in society, what ideas govern your life, and etc. And honestly, the notion itself isn't really all that new. One could draw parallels quite easily with Thucydides' idea of justice simply being what is the benefit of the greater. An idea that has its birth in, antiquity. And with that being the case, many of the postmodernists ascertain that one of the ways to mitigate this predicament for the sake of achieving equity, or whatever, is to partake in a practice called deconstruction. Deconstruction seeks to interrogate social notions and definitions and figure out if these definitions can be renegotiated and possibly find if these previously agreed upon definitions benefit a certain party over another unfairly. Sometimes the people who are proponents of this are called post-structuralists. A big criticism that a lot of people have towards these post-structuralists is that they seek to disassemble structures but not necessarily replace them with anything. It's sort of as the saying goes, you're all complaints but no solution. However, a generous example of this would be how postmodernists investigate and dissect terms like masculinity and femininity, i.e., the observation that words that tend to correspond with masculinity are typically more positive, assertiveness, strength, courage, and etc., whereas the words that are associated with femininity are typically perceived to be more negative, submissive, fragile, temperamental, etc. And henceforth, these definitions of femininity and masculinity need to be reevaluated due to the fact that many feel that these associations are only meant to condition women to be nothing more than obsequious subordinates consigned to the bidding of their assertive, strong, and courageous overlords. So they say. Perhaps some would go even as far to say that masculinity and femininity, woman, man, are just total fabrications with no real adherence to the quote-unquote truth. And perhaps these structures need to be dismantled and so on and so forth. You get the idea. However, this way of thinking can get a little bit over the top at times, to say the least. For example, a paper entitled The Conceptual Penis delves into this issue of how the penis, as we know it, and I say as we know it because, according to the postmodernists, even biology is held suspect due to the fact that biology has mainly been a field dominated by men, and they clearly have imposed their cis-normative bigotry or whatever into what we call science, and therefore, you know, it's the objectivity of science is brought into question. Damn all empirical improvements to human life and mitigated suffering that have come as a result of the scientific method and biology and whatever. And honestly, I'm not being hyperbolic about this in the slightest. There are definitely people in college institutions who think like this. I was taught by many of them. Uh, to be fair, the paper was intended to be satirical, and the authors originally composed the work as a means to highlight the utter lack of intellectual rigor or coherency that pervades postmodern literature. The fact it was actually published and peer-reviewed and made the cut for the final publication kind of is a testament to the situation. I mean, you think people like Jordan Peterson should be appointed the head chef at the word salad buffet. I'm sorry, but a lot of postmodernist literature, especially Derrida and Lacan, these people are like 5-star Michelin chefs when it comes to concocting word salads. Anyways, I digress. Quite literally, the paper claims that the penis should not be viewed as an anatomical reality, but as a damaging social construction, as stated in the paper. We conclude that penises are not best understood as the male sexual organ or as a male reproductive organ, but instead as an enacted social construct that is both damaging and problematic for society and future generations. The conceptual penis presents significant problems for gender identity and reproductive identity within social and family dynamics, is exclusionary to disenfranchised communities based upon gender or reproductive identity, is an enduring source of abuse for women and other gender marginalized groups and individuals, is the universal performative source of rape, and is the conceptual driver behind much of climate change. Yep, you heard that right. The penis, as a socially constructed tool solely intended to be an instrument of subjugation, is responsible for climate change. So yeah, as you can see, this mindset kind of has a tendency to create a delusion of meaninglessness. It takes relativism to the nth degree. Every idea is racked with contradictions except the idea that every idea is racked with contradictions, and it provides no remedy for it. So, no, I'm not the biggest fan of postmodernism. One can hardly say postmodernism is a monolithic set of ideas, however. There is great overlap between thinkers, certainly. All of them seem to be in consensus on the fact that power politics are important, language largely shapes reality, and a lot of things are socially constructed. All of which are arguably true to a certain extent, I concede. That being said, I would like to think that the most pertinent things are usually the result of synergy occurring between biological and social forces. This is particularly the case when it comes to hierarchies as a whole. Some components of hierarchies are indeed total social constructions. Democracy, absolute monarchy, theocracy, they're all inventions of the human mind. They aren't inherent to nature. However, regardless of the system, people exhibiting certain behaviors seem to be more capable than those not possessing certain characteristics when it comes to rising to the top of these hierarchies. Tenacity, ambition, intelligence, etc., they just simply seem to be traits nature has dictated to be more conducive for leadership. That seems to be the case across societies and even across species. Some people have referred to this as social Darwinism or survival of the fittest. Granted, assessing the social components of structures and figuring out how it can be improved upon by adding mechanisms to the systems that hamper our more destructive impulses, of course, is advisable. We are indeed a species that have the capacity for complex thought and self-awareness. However, we are indeed still part animal, and are beholden to natural processes that honestly don't really give a damn about social conventions. I feel the failure of postmodernism is that it views humans as being all thought and no animal. So with that being said, let's dive into Marxism. Marxism is a little bit more straightforward. Marxism seeks to end private ownership of the means of production and eventually usher in a society that is classless, stateless, and moneyless. The idea is to rid ourselves of hierarchies that are inherently unjust in the eyes of communists or Marxists. I'll be using the terms Marxist and communist interchangeably. Some people would argue with that, but whatever, make your own video. Things like inheritance exemplify why Marxists have such a disdain for private property. Why should someone who didn't work for something reap the rewards of someone who did just because they're related? Why should the child of owned property, such as a factory, receive more of a share of the factory's profits than all the workers that sacrifice their body and time for the sake of the venture? Now, Marx and his proponents knew that these ends could only be achieved through, as he puts it, despotic inroads. The fact is, a sizable amount of even mildly well-to-do people would be reluctant to relinquish propriety over their property for the sake of a collective. He envisioned this social revolution arising via a workers' revolt, which would precipitate in the formation of a vanguard party that would seize government responsibilities and assume the task of managing the nation's industries. The vanguard party, in theory, would gradually dissolve itself and transfer power to the people. In this sense, Marxism is very anti-postmodern. They do believe in meta-narratives like class warfare and a grand human story arc that concludes with the workers achieving full emancipation and post-scarcity and whatever. They do believe in notions like justice, injustice, and the need to rectify one for the sake of the other. Unfortunately, from a empirical standpoint, Marxism has pretty much failed as far as achieving its desired end aims. Reason being, once you've been granted total power in the realm of political decision-making and economy to a vanguard party under the auspices of it being a sort of dictatorship for the proletariat, it's typically hard for those in those positions of power to just give it up on their own volition. This, at least to me, is the fatal flaw of communism. It seeks to end unfair hierarchies by means of erecting an all-powerful hierarchy that controls pretty much all facets of society, and expects that same institution to just give it up benevolently somewhere down the road once post-scarcity has been achieved or whatever. True communism that has achieved all the benchmarks Karl Marx had in mind has never been tried because creating a provisional single-party government that wields all power and expecting that organization with complex, mutually beneficial power arrangements to give it up willingly simply runs contrary to everything we know about human nature and the nature of power. So, do labels like postmodern neo-Marxism hold any credence? I would argue yeah, at least in some cases. Granted, many postmodernists such as Derrida were often despised by communists. Undoubtedly, their ideas were at least partially derived by Marxist thinkers. Foucault was indeed a member of the Communist Party in France, albeit his involvement was minimal, and he eventually went on to criticize many tenets of Marxism. In turn, modern Marxism certainly has had a tinge of influence from postmodernism. How so? Well, postmodernists have a fixation with power dynamics, and that supposedly purely arose out of social construction. But because hierarchies and power structures aren't clearly just social constructs and exist elsewhere in nature, and even if they weren't, tough shit. Because at least as long as this whole civilization venture has been a thing, we've had a pretty acute affinity for them. Although many postmodernists do reject notions such as meta-narratives, many see that accepting some aspects of there being a meta-narrative to use as a lens to view how life unfolds to be quite useful for achieving tangible, real-world goals. This idea is a hybrid of Marxism, which is hyper-fixated on all variables of power disparity outside of class. Neo-Marxism is simply the application of intersectionality to the whole class warfare discussion. Intersectionality most definitely has been influenced by postmodern thinkers. It's not only the rich who should be held in contempt in neo-Marxism, it is the rich, white, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied man. Now, not all Marxists are neo-Marxists or adherents of critical theory, and not all postmodernists would describe themselves concurrently as being neo-Marxists. There were indeed postmodernists who felt communism was too rigidly structural in nature. However, it's fairly common for people in both camps to inhabit the same circles and incorporate ideas from both schools of thought, even though total adherence to both would be inherently contradictory. However, political ideologies are oftentimes riddled with internal contradictions. Some would say that libertarian socialism is innately oxymoronic. Others would say the same about anarcho-capitalism. People make compromises with their belief system all the time, and I don't really see why claiming people do the same with postmodernism and Marxism is somehow intellectually discrediting. I mean, at least in my experience, people who like Foucault typically also like Marx, Rosenberg, and etc. They typically view both philosophies as being useful for achieving equity or a better understanding of how things quote-unquote really are. So no, I don't think it's dumb. Some people can honestly be best described as being postmodern neo-Marxists. There, I said it. So as many of you can see, this is my first video. If you didn't absolutely hate it and are keen on being updated whenever I upload it in the future, I would appreciate it if you could hit the subscribe button, the notification button, consider becoming a patron on Patreon, and add me on all the various social media sites. Although I'm sure this came across as rather unpolished, it was fun nevertheless, and I'll scrounge some time together to do it again here soon. Thanks and have a nice day.